Hello. The Divine Code reading for July 15th, pages 75 and 76. Beginning of chapter 4, divine liability to divine and earthly punishments. There are some essential aspects of the 7 Noahide commandments that carry liability to capital punishment if they are transgressed as a divine decree. Their warning is considered their liability to death, meaning that as soon as an adult becomes aware that one of these particular actions is prohibited, from that point on, if he willfully transgresses it, he will become liable to death in the judgment of God. Therefore, it will be explained later in the section for each Noahide commandment which exact actions make one liable to death. There are also many prohibitions in the Noahide Code which are not explicitly warned about, and one is not liable to death for transgressing them, as will be explained. And this is clear from Rambam, Laws of Kings, chapter 10, halakha 6, in regards to the prohibitions of cross-grafting different species of fruit trees or cross-mating different species of animals. So there's a variety of prohibitions in the Noahide Code. Becoming aware of them, and there can be different understandings of what that means. Some understandings is that it's explained in the Bible, so everybody should know it. Other understandings is it just should be innately aware in the human existence that these things are right or wrong. Other understandings is when a person is told about them, or when a person comes to understand it. If we say when a person becomes aware, when an adult becomes aware, does that mean that he actually internalize it and become aware, or does it just simply mean that he has to be informed in less of a intense manner, but it just simply the information has to be out there? So these are all questions we has to be addressed. And this will be explained. So that's the purpose of this chapter, is to address this question of what makes something liable. Both men and women are equally obligated to keep these commandments and receive punishment from a Torah-based court if they are convicted of transgressing them. Halakha number 2. A Gentile is not liable to death unless he willfully commits one of the actions that is a capital sin. However, if he errs without intention to transgress, he is not liable. For example, a man who enters a dark room and has relations with his neighbor's wife, thinking that she is his wife or is an unmarried woman, or one who eats a limb that is severed from a living animal while mistakenly thinking that it was the animal had been killed. However, if he errs in judging his known actions as permissible, this is not considered as erring without intention. Rather, it is close to being a willful sin, and he is liable, since he should have learned the major stringencies of the 7 Noahide commandments and failed to do so. For example, one who knows he is having relations with his neighbor's wife but he thinks she is permitted to him, and he does not know the prohibition against adultery, or one who knowingly eats meat that was severed from a living animal, but he does not know that it is forbidden. So if the person doesn't know that the meat is from a living animal, he assumes it's from a dead animal, and there's no reason to think otherwise for him. It's a reasonable mistake. Then that would not be considered liability for him. But if he gets confused about how the law works, he should have understood how the law worked, and he would be liable at this stage of understanding the halak is involved. Likewise, if he erred because he did not check well enough to know if his action would make him liable or not, this is not considered erring without intention. Rather, it is close to a willful act, since he should have checked to see, and he did not. For example, one who knows the prohibition against adultery, but he had relations for the sake of marriage without knowing that the woman was already married to another man. He should have checked carefully to find out if she was married or single before having marital relations with her. See Tractate Makut 9a and Rashi there, where it explains, according to the opinion of Rava, whom the law coincides with, that if Avimelech would have had relations with Sarah, God forbid, this is shown in Genesis chapter 20, he would have been considered neglectful and liable to death for the sin of adultery, since he should have asked and found out if Sarah was married or not. This applies to all Gentiles. So in the Bible, Abraham and Sarah, they go to a city. Abraham is worried that he may be killed in order for someone to take Sarah. Therefore, he tells people that Sarah is his sister. It is discovered that they're married. Avimelech asks, "Well, why didn't you tell us you're married?" And if somebody had relations with the married woman without first checking, now they had no the person in the town would have just seen a woman walking around. They may have assumed that she was not married. They should check. There needs to be a reasonable checking involved. It's like if you see a lost article on, that looks like it was just left there. Someone left their duffel bag on the ground, and someone else walks along and says, "Oh, look at that, something's just left there." You can't just pick it up and walk away with it. There has to be a checking involved before knowing if something is okay. Some kind of reasonable level of checking, a reasonable level of checking if a woman is married, a reasonable level of checking if a limb is from a living animal. It appears that this is the case for adultery, since many women are married, and therefore one is obligated to investigate whether the woman is single or married. This applies whether for an action which might be idol worship or stealing as well. But in regard to the prohibition against eating meat from a living animal, a person may eat regular meat if he does not inquire as to where it came from, since most food meat is not severed from a living animal. Since this is uncommon, It appears that in this case, one is considered faultless since he is not obligated to be concerned with a small probability. Now, this would be in a society where most meet. You go to a restaurant, you go to a grocery store, most, nobody would expect to find a limb from a living animal at a restaurant. That would be so unusual. Therefore, you don't really have to be concerned with that. Likewise, in some societies where a married woman has her head covered, an unmarried woman does not, you would expect that to be a reasonable level of investigation, whether or not the woman has her head covered. It depends on the society. I mean, most Western societies today, that's not the case. And even whether or not the woman has a wedding ring may not be a clear indication. In our American society, a lot of single women wear wedding rings, so they're not bothered. And some married women don't have wedding rings. Therefore, a wedding ring would not be a proper level of investigation. It appears that if a person errs in judgment, his known action is permissible. No, it appears that if a person errs in judging, his known action is permissible. He is only liable for the transgression if he should have learned that it was forbidden, as would be the case if his community as a whole knows the 7 no-hide commandments. But in areas or times in which the community does not know some of these commandments at all, one cannot say that he should have learned them, for it was not possible, and therefore he is not liable for them. So in a society where if you're in a society where people don't see anything wrong with picking up duffel bags that they see laying on the ground, everybody accepts that as something that happens, then a person that lives in that society, it's possible that he would not realize that you can't just take a duffel bag, or you can't just take something lying on the ground. And therefore, in that case, even though the person should have known better, and perhaps they're liable, but they're not really, they're given leniency in that case because they're in a society where they weren't taught any better, and people in that society don't act according to that. Rather, a Gentile should first be taught and warned about the Noahide code, and only afterwards is he responsible for his actions in regard to prohibitions against serving idols, forbidden relations, and eating meat that is severed from a living animal. So these are in areas that, as explained in the divine code, these 3 areas are areas that there can be leniency given because the community didn't know any better. However, for the prohibitions against murder and stealing, and for the commandment to establish courts of justice, which are all logically binding, there is no exception for not knowing that these are forbidden. Si responsa, Avni Neitzer or Chaim, chapter 345, which explains that even for a murderer, we can find an instance where a person is not liable, since he did not learn about it and is not necessarily logical. For example, would be euthanasia, which logically could be viewed as a kindness, since the person's physical suffering is ended. The rule here would be that in a community where the concepts of the 7 Noahide commandments are not known, one would not be liable for an act of homicide. One would be liable for an act of homicide, but not for euthanasia. So we're arguing that certain of the Noahide commandments are logical and other ones may not be. I'm not sure. I'm not convinced on this, because in these other areas that we would think are logical, what I would consider logical, a person in another society or another grown up in a different way may not see it as so. There may be people that grow up in a society which doesn't consider certain types of murder, like the example of euthanasia, to be logical, to say there's a prohibition against murder. There's people that would say the prohibition against abortion doesn't seem logical to them. I mean, what, you're gonna raise a baby up before the mother is able to take care of it properly? It would be a kindness to kill the baby and then have a baby later on when the mother's in a better situation. We can come up with logical explanations. If you go to a jail, you go to prison, you talk to people, you're going to find all sorts of logical explanations for things. Why it was reasonable the person did what he did. And this is in a society where they're putting people in jail, therefore everybody knows it. They should know it's wrong to do such a thing. But the human intellect, if we rely upon logic, is going to come up with explanations for anything. Logic could be come up with for anything. Therefore, to say that it should have been logical, I'm not sure how we're putting murder in one category or stealing in one category and putting forbidden relations in another one, because there are societies where it would be perfectly reasonable to, the prohibition against adultery would be perfectly reasonable, and killing somebody under certain circumstances, blood feuds in that, would be logically explained. So really it depends on the society the person is being raised in as to how these things can be understood. It also appears that there is no erring in regard to blasphemy. Once one knows that there is a God and he knows his name, it is logically clear that it is forbidden to curse God. If one does not know about God at all, or does not understand what he is saying in Hebrew or other language, his curse is not considered blasphemy. So this would be a case where, until you understand the law would not be in effect. Therefore, as soon as the person, the understanding of the law becomes the institution of the law for the person. And that clearly shows that there's a connection between understanding and liability in the prohibition against blasphemy, and that can be also understood in a roundabout way with the other laws. Thank you.